Space Demon Daikengo was first released in Japan in July of 1978, and its 26th and final episode would air in February the following year. The first episode was fan-subbed into English in September 2013, and the final was in May 2018. The fansubs were released under the Lura banner, but that group's WordPress site presents the project as a collaboration with TMU Subs, as well as several other independent translators. The show starts in media res. The Magellans, an expansionist space empire, sends their warfleet against the planet Llama to make it their latest conquest in their efforts to seize control of the galaxy. Opposing them are troops from planet Imperius led by Prince Zamson, who hopes to halt the Magellans' advance. Despite his prowess, he's brought low through the underhanded tactics of the Magellans' robot general, the wicked Rebolian. News of Prince Zamson's death arrives on Imperius and dampens the spirits of its king and queen. King Empel, guided by the treasonous Minister Doles, is reluctant to continue resistance against the Magellans. When his second son, Ryger, notes that the approach of the Devil Star will reactivate their planet's ancient super robot Daikengo, the king outright forbids him from making use of it.
Ryger, お前はわしの後継ぎなのだ。決起に流行って多くの犠牲者を出すような乱暴な振る舞いは許さんぞ。
ライガー王子。
荒くれ者が。
Nonetheless, a Magellan attack on neighboring allied planet Spartius necessitates action. King Empel commands his youngest son, the even-tempered Prince Ryger, to bring Daikengo to their defense. Unwilling to leave the fighting to his less skilled brother, Prince Ryger and his ally Cleo, daughter to the scheming minister, seize the Daikengo and rush to combat the Magellan's forces.
まあ帰れと言ったところで素直に帰る連中じゃなし。よし、その代わりライガー王子だけはやめてくれ。王子家業はさらりと捨てたんだ。
わかったわよ、ライガー。
いいぞいいぞ、その調子だ。スパルリアスのロボレオンに殴り込みだ。行くぞ。
This action, which already skirts treason, is made all the more fraught when the Magellan forces propose a peace treaty, generously proposing an end of hostilities in return for the surrender of the Daikengo robot. Correctly recognizing this as a false promise, Prince Ryger refuses orders to relinquish the robot and continues the offensive against the Magellans. In response to Ryger's unauthorized counterattack, and to ensure negotiations proceed, King Empel is persuaded to order his own forces to attack his son.
ライガー王子をロボレオンの前に差し出し怒りを鎮める以外に道はありません。それはライガーを殺すことになるのだぞ。
何を言うんだ。僕のたった一人の兄さんなんだ。
After they are forced to defend themselves, Cleo leaves Ryger to contact her father in person, hopeful the Minister of Defense will clear up what she believes to be a misunderstanding. Instead, she overhears her father plotting to betray planet Imperius to the Magellans. As she confronts her father, he moves to capture her, and she only barely manages to escape back to the Daikengo with Ryger.
エンペリアスで何かあったのか。
いいえ、別に。
隠さなくてもいいぜ。俺の親父が暗殺命令者だったんだろ。驚きやしねえ。
Cleo is ashamed at her father's treachery. Ryger is at a loss hearing that his own father has commanded his death. And the wicked forces of the Magellans, headed by the murderous and underhanded Rebolian, pillage the planets of the Galactic Alliance even as they inch ever closer to planet Imperius itself. Across the wide rim of the galaxy, amongst the shooting stars, evil strikes. Nothing obstructs the approach of this universal perdition, other than the righteous anger of Daikengo. Previous robot shows I've covered on this channel have been works by Studio Sunrise, an animation studio which has had an outsized impact on the development of the genre, to the extent you can really call shows with piloted robots a genre. Each of them has to some extent iterated on the form in a manner which would continue forward to later shows, even those made by other studios. They've by and large been well-produced, entertaining shows, most of which are well-regarded even now. Space Demon Daikengo isn't that. It's a curiosity. It has some very fascinating elements, and the story behind the show is compelling, but it is a cartoon that few robot fans know about, let alone anyone else. It came out at the tail end of the 70s at a low point in the super robot boom, after the initial wave of Mazinger Z imitators had died out, but before the genre got its second wind in the 80s. Lacking the infamy of other bad shows, such as the legendarily unwatchable and inexplicable Gingeyser, and lacking the prestige of something like Dan Guard Ace, which had the involvement of Leiji Matsumoto, it has become about as obscure as maybe any show of this era. My own interest in Daikengo came about from a rather circuitous and serendipitous place, which tied into my introduction to the wider giant robot fandom itself. Now, I had certainly knew of the idea of a giant piloted robot from a young age, but my exposure to them was limited. I remember renting Robot Jocks on VHS and Armored Core on PSX, both from Blockbuster, and seeing displays for the MechWarrior games in Micro Center. I also knew there was something called Robotech and Battletech, and they were maybe related to MechWarrior, but also not the same thing somehow. Beyond whatever vague generalities, there wasn't much I actually had access to as some broke kid. But I eventually had the internet, which meant that when I stumbled across a fan translation of the first episode of Getter Robo by the fan subgroup Hero Legends, I could watch it without having to pay $80 I didn't have for a VHS tape. And as the internet, and BitTorrent in particular, brought fan subbing outside of college anime clubs and boutique labels and into the computer, I found myself as a member of a new internet-based fandom for these older shows. It was within this new fandom that a set of videos began to be circulated. 34 years of super robots. These 4 videos purported to contain the opening title sequences of every robot cartoon that aired on television since the 60s. It did have some omissions, but it was still the most complete lists of such shows available in the Western fandom at that time. It would be many would-be fans' first exposure to several shows. At the very tail end of the video containing the 70s was Daikengo, and even as a neonate fan it stood out to me. It was a super robot operating in space, set against deep, dark blue nebulas, fighting on a brown, craggy field, evidently the surface of an asteroid or some such. This is an immediate distinction from the sky blues and emerald greens of any number, nearly every other, kids' robot show that preceded it. It fought with fencing foils, implying a focus on swordplay when earlier shows were bigger on striking and grappling. And certain design elements, such as its darker colors, the shoulder shields, and a general sort of heavy ornamentation, felt more in line with later robot shows from the early 80s rather than the 70s. Add in how it transformed into a spaceship, and you have something that fit much more closely with the coming 80s space robot shows than with the more earthbound robots of the 70s. And yes, other robot shows of that decade took place in space, such as the following year's Daltanius and yes, Mobile Suit Gundam, but Daikengo evidently beat them to the punch. All in all, the show gave quite the impression of being a forerunner. Now, it was no surprise that I hadn't heard of Daikengo before then. Most of the cartoons showcased in the 34 years of videos were new to the folks watching them. That's the whole reason they became so popular. But as I would come to find out, even outside of my group, barely anyone had heard of it. I would learn that it did air in Spain and Italy, but there were no fan sites that I could find, nor was there any remnants of any Japanese fandom. Hell, you could barely find records of its toy. The most I did learn was that the main bad guy was named Robolian and that he was a robot Napoleon. But that was plenty. You bet your ass that a super robot with fangs that spit fire and used fencing foils to fight against Robolian, the robot Napoleon, would spark my interest. So how tragic that now that I really wanted to learn about the show, that there wasn't anything for me to find. Such a striking show couldn't possibly be that middling and forgettable, could it? Well, it was eventually fully fan-subbed in English, so let's take a look. The show's concept is that our heroes, Prince Ryger and Cleo, and their 2 awful robots that I hate, Dynaki and Odoke, fly through the space aboard the Daikengo, both to harass the conquered Magellans and to flee from their own planet's forces who are pursuing them to placate the Magellans. Along the way, they stumble upon various adventures as they land on some planet, pick up some distress call, or something along those lines. Often, they stumble upon some sinister Magellan plot, which they heroically thwart. The day will be saved, possibly with some terrible cost on behalf of some guest character, to lend a tinge of bittersweetness. As they fly off to do more good elsewhere, the narrator will say something poetic, such as, "Ryger and his comrades can never have peace of mind. There are no peaceful stars. However, in the darkness of space, evil has to be stopped." With the lovely Cleo, Ryger continues his pilgrimage in the infinite universe. The base level concept of Daikengo is quite unique for a super robot show of this time. Prince Ryger and Cleo wander the stars because they are actively being hunted by the forces of planet Imperius, the very planet they most wish to protect. It's a little bit Robin Hood and very distinct from the typical launch from a single base to protect the local town conceit that was far more common. It's also quite distinct in that it takes place in outer space. One of the very first things that caught my eye watching Daikengo was how the Earth ain't here. Our heroes are from planet Imperius. Planet Imperius is a major planet in the Galactic Alliance, the whole edifice of which is slowly being conquered by the forces of the planet Magellan, the core of the Magellan Empire. The 80s do have many robot shows that take place entirely on separate planets or simply in space, but Daikengo beat them all to the punch. Do note how the characters aren't wearing chrome jumpsuits or fishbowl space helmets, and they're not fighting with laser guns. They're wearing pseudo-Roman armor, robes, high-collared tunics, and they have goofy cartoon broadswords and rapiers. There's a mock historical aesthetic to everything. This might seem unremarkable today, but it's a far cry from the gee-whiz science fiction of earlier shows. And while you can find some precedent for the mock historical in earlier works, it's a look that's typically associated with the bad guys. General Garuda and Prince Heinel wore historical garb and swung around swords, but they were bad guys, and their opposite numbers were color-coded fire suits. The elephant in the room is Star Wars, which was released in Japan in June of 1978, 1 month before Daikengo aired. Of course, it had already become a cultural phenomenon. To my eye, a lot of what makes Daikengo different from other super robot shows seems like it comes from imitating Star Wars, but there's something profoundly interesting in how it's an early imitator. Daikengo heavily predates The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi, let alone the monolith the Star Wars extended universe would become, and that means it takes its imitation to what might now seem like surprising directions. For example, one of the big cliches with Star Wars is that when one of those movies portrays a planet, you should probably think of it as a very small country or a city-state. Tatooine is a desert with some farms and a port city. Naboo is a single capital city and its colonial holdings. Geonosis is a termite mound, factory world, etc., etc. In Daikengo, planets are smaller and less diverse than even those. Any given planet is likely to be portrayed as one village, and often not a particularly large village. Sometimes a planet will be one small outpost and then wilderness, if not barren rock. One episode has Daikengo visit a planet which is completely out of snake anti-venom. We're told that couriers visit once a year to provide needed supplies. Another episode has the villainous rebellion round up a planet's entire population between scenes. Often a planet will be captured or rescued based on who has control of its single government building. If Daikengo is different from other super robot shows by being one of the first to take note of Star Wars, then Daikengo is also different from Star Wars by having a perspective of space feudalism that is more informed by other popular Japanese media. In particular, I suspect a strong influence from the Taiga dramas. Taiga dramas are, a series of live-action period dramas frequently but not exclusively based on novels which began airing on the NHK network in the early 60s. They tend to feature an eclectic mix of not just well-known television actors, but also stage actors, including kabuki, singers, comedians, and voice actors. While it would be impossible to summarize a series of shows that has gone on for over 50 years now, my quite limited understanding is that the series had a reputation for a very theatrical style of melodrama, with misunderstandings and palace intrigue being common devices. Taiga dramas are awkward to discuss because they haven't really been a cultural export in the West directly, but some derivatives of it have. The Legend of the Galactic Heroes is a space opera book series in anime that has some acclaim in the West, and Anime magazine described it as a Taiga drama, for one example. The drama Ryger and Cleo find themselves in, on the run from planet Imperius after their king takes unwise advice from an unfaithful minister, seems quite of a kind with all of that. Several episodes' plot lines touch on the broader politics of the setting, with the polities on the various planets they visit having their own opinions on planet Imperius, the Magellans, and our heroes' renegade efforts in the conflict. I'm certain Daikengo's premise is effectively that of a Taiga drama by way of popular science fiction. To be clear, this is not a criticism in any sense. Daikengo is a robot cartoon. All robot cartoons took influence from other properties. Even Mazinger Z, the original, took heavy inspiration from the Thunderbirds and the Ultraman series. But while X-genre pastiche but set in space will have more than a few examples by the early 80s, Daikengo doing all of that now made it surprisingly ahead of the game. A source of drama early on comes from Cleo's guilt over her father's treachery, leading her to take reckless action that frequently endangers her. Episode 4 has her seize an opportunity to sneak into an enemy battleship whose force field had earlier withstood the Daikengo's attacks. She does this without informing Ryger, not wanting him to talk her out of such risky action. She reasons that by risking her life, she can partly atone for her father's sins. She succeeds in disabling its force field, but is captured in turn. Preferring to use her as a hostage rather than immediately execute her, Rebolian offers her to Ryger in exchange for the Daikengo. But during negotiations, Cleo tells Ryger that the force field is disabled and urges him to take the opportunity to attack. She tells them that she can escape on her own. Ryger trusts her and attacks. When he finally downs the ship, and the episode's obligatory giant monster, which was just waiting off screen, he hurries to enter the wreck. This is not so he could help rescue Cleo, who was fully able to escape on her own, and, in fact, is found standing over a pile of enemy corpses. This was so he could comfort her, since clearly she'd have to be in a lot of pain to behave this way.
父はロボレオのスパイに。
何？ダルスが？
私は悪い父親を持った娘。許されはしない。
俺も父に背いた。クレオ、信じるんだ。俺たちの心が分かってくれる日が必ず来る。それまでは戦うんだ。
They bond over the shared disappointment at their terrible fathers, return to the Daikengo, and as they fly away, we see them share a smile. In my teeny tiny little robot show videos, I try to take a minute to shed a light on how these shows treat its female characters. Often it's not great, and usually the big issue, as I see it, is that they tend to be less defined than their male counterparts, and their actions tend to be given a smaller focus. Somehow Space Demon Daikengo, of all shows, handles this better than most. Cleo takes action, drives the storyline, gets caught yet is able to escape on her own, killing dozens of people in the process. Ryger, for his part, is shown putting his trust in her without a second thought, and at the end of the episode, it's him who empathizes with her. The bar may be below the ground, but credit for walking over it all the same. He does also slap her for being so reckless, which ain't great, but this is a 70s cartoon. I'll take what I can get. Throughout all 26 episodes, the show does a good job of showing her to be a capable deuteragonist. She ends up saving him as often as the reverse. Moreover, the drama with her father being a traitor is compelling, and is a fun contrast with Ryger being an outlaw prince. It gives the two of them quite a bit in common, and helps make them a genuinely cute couple. This is also an opportunity to talk about another thing that Daikengo did first. Daikengo's main alternative form is the Space Ranger, it's spaceship mode, and it's a location, a setting within the show. Cleo and Ryger live together there. I don't really have anything more to say about that, just that having the robot be a living space is a surprisingly uncommon arrangement, even in shows today, and Daikengo did it back in '78. As far as the bad guys go, there's far less to say about them. They mostly exist to provide an excuse for the hero's family drama. They're the invading army. They fly in spaceships that look like fish skeletons, they have weakly giant robots that look like dinosaur skeletons. They hail from the planet Magellan and are mostly led by Rebolian, the robot Napoleon. He in turn answers to his creator, Lady Barracross, and there are a handful of episodes that show her taking orders from Emperor Magellan, the actual guy in charge. But mostly it's just Rebolian and whatever forces he's commanding in a given episode. The one thing that is interesting is the dynamic between Lady Barracross and Rebolian. Lady Barracross built Rebolian and she keeps him in line through sexual teasing. The basic routine is that she flirts and butters him up as her greatest creation, before putting him down for continuing to lose against Daikengo, and then laying out some new scheme for getting one over on the heroes. Of course, the big, strong, and handsome Rebolian will manage to pull off a victory this time, won't he? Finally, she dismisses the robot to go do his job. And that's... I don't really have a problem with a cartoon show being horny. You can check out my video on Daitarn 3 for evidence of that. But this gag is just so at odds with the rest of the show. It's so strange for the show to have this whole Venus and Furs routine every couple of episodes. Maybe twice across the whole series does it actually become ribald, but frankly that's just often enough to highlight how chaste the rest of the show is. And frankly, I wonder if this isn't too esoteric for some adults. Past that, the show can be very inconsistent on how dangerous the Magellans are. Because the show tends to portray planets as basically small villages, for the most part you get the sense that Magellan forces operate as small outfits. They only need to be large enough to seize the one government building on whatever planet to seize that planet, and conversely the single Daikengo and its crew are more than enough to drive them away. But then there's episodes like Episode 16, The Migratory Birds of the Stars, or Episode 24, The Challenge of Star Satan, a fantastic title, in which the Magellans flat out depopulate entire planets, if not blow up those planets altogether. And that's a step up from them being goofy paper tigers for our heroes to knock over. A good super robot cartoon needs distinctive villains, and the Magellans having this odd kink relationship and otherwise being ephemerally defined is a real weakness of the show. There is one other heroic character to mention. a mysterious masked cyborg warrior who flies in out of the blue atop his robot horse from time to save the day, or else deliver some exposition that helps drive an episode's plot. This is Bryman, and his stupid robot horse is a thoroughbreder, and I'll guess that you've already guessed this whole deal already. I'll remind everyone that Ryger had an older brother, Zamson, who was shown being run through in episode 1. Do I need to say anything else? The show sure doesn't seem to think so. Ryger straightforwardly asks Bryman if he's his brother in only his third on-screen appearance. Bryman's deflection of, if thinking that I'm him makes you stronger, go ahead and think that, is a little cute for my taste. I'm half tempted to take it as a firmly tongue-in-cheek riff, even if the show plays it straight. Speed Racer, or Mach Go 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 if you prefer, aired in 1967. It was super popular and was over 10 years old at this point. Is this cheap imitation, or just playing the hits? As one of those characters, Bryman is adequate, I suppose. He's lonesome, he's mysterious, he's got some cool moves. The big thing that holds him back is just how dumb the thoroughbred or space horse is. It's like a child's rocking horse, and that means that rather than looking like a mounted knight or a motorcycle biker, he instead looks like an angry teenager whose mom made him ride the merry-go-round with her. And as for why it looks like a rocking horse, my bet is that was a cheap imitation of Flying Vehicles and Starzinger, a Leiji Matsumoto production that began airing a few months earlier. Bryman is central to one of the better episodes of the series. Episode 13 sees the Magellan Command nervous about Bryman. While the Daikengo might be a more dangerous opponent, they understand Daikengo. It's an ancient super robot from the planet Imperius, powered by the Devil Star. Bryman, however, is a cyborg, and the Magellans doubt any forces outside of their own could have built such a thing. If you then factor in how Bryman always knows when the Daikengo and its pilots are in danger, then it starts to look like they have a mole. To address this, they built their own giant robot, Spal, to track down and assassinate Bryman and hopefully get some clues on his contact. Spal has an absolutely incredible design. Vaguely heroic good guy robot shaped, but painted burgundy on gray with red and orange highlights, a villainously desaturated color scheme. Its cylindrical head looks like it came from a tin robot from the 60s, and its pentagonal faceplate, jagged crown, and pickelhaube spike are just very fun design elements. I think it's cooler than more than a few titled robots from other shows, and I can't help but be charmed by its efforts to sneak up on its target. But before it even finds Bryman, it chances upon Ryger, who it rescues from some alien wildlife. I was just passing by, Spal says before it flies off. This puts Ryger in a tough spot when Spal does track down and engage Bryman. Ryger attempts to broker a stand-down between the two as he feels indebted to them both, and it's Bryman who refuses. Bryman can't let Spal leave after it discovered his hideout, or he'll put the scientist who built his cyborg body at risk of being found out. Moreover, he insists that robots don't know the difference between good and evil, they only follow orders. Spal does escape, but contrary to Bryman's assumptions, it not only leads our heroes to the Magellan's base, but refuses to continue following its orders. It then dies fighting alongside Ryger against the Magellans. Now, there's the road Bryman learns not to be robo-racist lesson, but there's also a more intriguing angle when we learn that just as Spal was programmed to assassinate Bryman himself was given the mission to assassinate Emperor Magellan, seemingly as a condition of being rebuilt as a cyborg. This is internal robot racism, and this is why he considers himself a different person, no longer identifying as Zamson, Ryger's older brother. This is one of the better episodes, but it leaves Bryman's character in an awkward position. The episode pretty much concludes his character arc, which means that he'll remain static for the rest of the show. What's the point of a mysterious masked hero after the mystery behind him is solved? And it's not like it's only the audience who knows. Ryger already had strong suspicions as to who he was. When a later episode dramatically asks, what is Bryman trying to achieve, it's hard not to respond, okay, but for real though. So from this point onwards, Bryman is just the good guy who happens to be an asshole, and who flies around on a dumb horse. When it comes to super robot shows in the 70s, there's three big names that stick out to me. Dynamic Productions, Toei, and Sunrise. Dynamic Productions and Toei started the whole craze off with Mazinger Z, followed by Great Mazinger and Getter Robo, and then their host of sequels. All of this was mostly in the first half of the decade, before the two had a litigious falling out. Sunrise produced many of the bigger hits in the latter half of the decade, and their hits included Yusha Raidin, Combattler V, Daiturn 3, And they would close off the decade with Mobile Suit Gundam and Space Runaway Idion, two of some of the most impactful shows in the genre. Up until now, this channel has mostly covered Sunrise's shows. If you mostly know Super Robot shows from the Super Robot Wars video games, whatever old 70s robot is your favorite is almost certainly from either Dynamic Productions or Sunrise. Space Demon Daikengo was instead made by Tori Productions, and if you haven't heard of Daikengo, be honest with me, then you sure as hell have not heard of Tori Productions. But you may have heard of the studio its founder, Jinzu Toriyumi, worked at previously. If we're not talking about just 70s Super Robot shows, but 70s kids action cartoons more generally, then there's another notable Japanese studio, Tatsunoko Productions. Tatsunoko produced Mach Go Go Go, or Speed Racer if you prefer, one of the earliest color television anime. Later, in '72, they made Gatchaman, a tremendously successful series which was renowned for being striking and dynamic even with its limited animation. It would later have some success in the West in its adaptation as Battle of the Planets, where it would be a keystone of one of the earliest US anime fandoms. Other notable early Tatsunoko productions include the comedic Time Boken series and Neo-Human Kasharn, which is a personal favorite 70s anime of mine. If you want to watch a cyborg and his dog do martial arts on an endless number of Nazi robots, then just pick any episode. It also features some early character design work from Yoshitaka Amano. Tatsunoko did produce one Super Robot show in this era, Go Whopper 5 Godam, but that is mostly remembered as a curiosity. They became a bigger name in the genre as we get into the 80s. To pull from the excellent The History of Tatsunoko from Anime Tunes, which is an absolutely fantastic site, Tatsunoko had a series of successes that grew the company up until the mid-70s, when a series of labor disputes across the industry saw many of its artists leave to find work elsewhere, whether that meant at other studios or simply leaving the industry altogether. Things that the company took an even more critical turn in '77 when its founder, Tatsuo Yoshida, died of liver cancer. Jinzu Toriyumi was a prominent scriptwriter for Tatsunoko for many years and had risen to be a director and head of the planning department. In 1977, he and other Tatsunoko alumni, Satoshi Sugiyama and Akiyoshi Sakai, left to form Tori Productions. And if you know to look for it, the lineage from Tatsunoko is very evident in Daikengo. Tatsunoko shows, and in particular their action shows, give their characters gadgets. Kasharn has his rocket belt, the science ninjas of Gatchaman have their ninja tools, any given series of Time Boken outfits their heroes with an eclectic set of toys. Tori Production gave its heroes in Daikengo Borutoken, sword belts. Ryger and Cleo, and a few other characters, can pull a fencing foil out from their waist in a single smooth motion. A smooth motion which, I'm going to insist, does not resemble anything else. They are very much a Tatsunoko-style gadget. This might also be an example of the show borrowing from Star Wars in an atypical fashion, as the belt swords are pretty much lightsabers, just as non-luminous metal fencing foils, although the sword belt might have another predecessor in Kamen Rider X's Rydal Grip. Another kind of Tatsunoko thing is to have heroes fight villains in improbable machines. Not giant robots, but like supercars or cool planes, or your own pet dog that turns into a drill tank. Daikengo, the robot Daikengo, doesn't combine into a giant robot like Combattler V or so many others, but starts as a giant robot and can split off into separate vehicles in a sort of reversal. And the vehicles it splits into are used in a much more Tatsunoko-like manner than the individual components of its contemporaries. The Tatsunoko lineage is also clear in certain particular visual elements. The way Daikengo portrays Earth military tanks deeply and distinctly recalls the portrayal of war machines in Tatsunoko's somewhat ambiguous 1971 production, Decision. This animentary, or animated documentary, set the standard for how anime would present tanks and fighter jets and such for decades. Take note of the line work and the use of grease pencils to produce heavy blacks. While this approach is not unique among Super Robot shows, this is undeniably a case where Tori Production directly follows from Tatsunoko's playbook. Now, some of you might be asking, what do you mean the show about space feudalism in space features Earth tanks from planet Earth? And you're correct, that is completely nuts. I'll touch on that later. Daikengo also heavily uses visual effects or special effects which were not produced through drawing or inking. These include the use of colored paint directly sprinkled on the cell. This is used in the show both to produce star fields, as well as what we might now call particle effects and explosions. Other special effects include using particular lenses to produce kaleidoscopic effects, and playing with light to produce highlights or stellar effects. These special effects are extremely telling of Tatsunoko's legacy. It is incredibly rare for a sunrise show of this era to use any similar effect. I'm confident that most shows this channel has covered haven't used them once across their runtimes. But they're all over Tatsunoko's work. They're practically their studio's calling card. And you see it in Daikengo too. To look at the show's style more broadly, while I earlier described the character's fashion in the show as being mock historical, I really commend Ryger and Cleo's setup for striking a kind of Disco Prince Valiant and Disco Robin Hood. The Wikipedia article for the show states that the fashion was meant to be androgynous, with the choice of Ryger's shirt having a long hem being an example of that. Since I'm speaking from the future world of the mid-2020s, I'm not particularly impressed, but in the 70s I guess people would call a straight man a slur for having long hair, so what do I know? And on the topic of long hair, we have got long hair. And more than length, we have volume. There is just so much goddamn hair on so many characters. A special shout out to Cleo's father, the traitorous Minister Doles, for maintaining a blonde ponytail even as the rest of his considerable mane turned gray. Another visual aspect of the show that I cannot emphasize enough are its excellent space vistas. Deep and vivid blues dominate every shot of a planet or starfield or nebula, alongside streaks of violet and greens and speckles of white and yellow, these speckles again being from sprinkling paint directly onto the cell. There's an almost childlike approach to the richness of these colors. It's a very Crayola color scheme. It's these establishing shots where Daikengo truly excels aesthetically. Past that, there are a lot of solid blocks of a single color or an even gradient between them, all penned into smooth curves with thick outlines. Indoor backgrounds and machines express this terrifically, as they can be composed of nothing but abstract shapes, which this style excels at. Somehow I always end up talking about control panels in these videos. It's all very UPA inspired, which means a lot of shots remind me of Dexter's Laboratory of all things. As far as the Daikengo itself, it was designed by Luminaire Kunio Okawara. I always appreciate seeing his pre-Gundam work, and to be honest, I really dig its design. I feel a lot of super robots have designs that are either too simple or too greebly, but I think Daikengo found a good balance. It's got the square limbs common to many of the Sunrise robots, but a darker and cooler color scheme that's heavier on the blues compared to the typical red and yellow color scheme common with Sunrise. The other designs in this show feel more perfunctory, but every once in a while there'll be a cool spaceship whose design shows Okawara's fingerprints. I mean that metaphorically for the most part. These ships from the start of episode 14 would pass as a Gundam's core fighter. But while most everything looks good in a still image, it isn't always so impressive in motion. I don't have to tell you that anime from the 70s wasn't always terrific, but many studios from this time, including Toei Animation, Sunrise, and Tatsunoko, produced startlingly excellent work. I aim to keep these essays relatively polite and clean, so when I say Toei Productions sure as fuck wasn't Toei or Sunrise, understand I use that language purely in the interest of academic rigor. To illustrate this, let's look at the fight choreography of the Daikengo robot itself, which is ideally the highlight of any Super Robot cartoon. It's just not very dynamically animated. The Daikengo's movements are wiggly, there's very little impact. There's also a lot of showing the robot performing an attack and then cutting to its opponent receiving the attack. That is a fine technique in moderation, but when a scene uses that too heavily, it gives the impression that the two opponents aren't actually engaging each other. That's all bad, but it's understandable as the product of a show being produced on a small budget with a small number of animators on a short schedule. Less explicable are some special attacks changing names in different episodes. When the Daikengo brings out its fencing foils, is that Arrow Fencer or Deadly Cross Swords? More often it's the first, but not always. The combat scenes also feature a lot of repeat animation. This is most evident in later episodes where whole segments might be lifted from previous episodes, but even early episodes will happily show the same stretch of animation twice in a row. But reused animation is prevalent even beyond fight choreography. It's most conspicuous in flashbacks, with episodes as early as number 4 repeating a 2-minute long segments from episode number 3. And then there's moments wherein repeat animation would be entirely permissible, such as a looping background, except that it doesn't loop correctly, leading to a visual discontinuity. It comes across as carelessness. Now is about as good a time as I'll get to bring up episode 14, which is another episode I mostly liked. It features Wazal, a cute little robot child who's eager to rescue her kidnapped scientist creator from bad guys. She kills a lot of bad guys in the rescued effort with her sword, and her sword is drawn as a different shape in every other shot. So, is this just a case of a new studio not being able to assert itself? Was Jinzu Toriumi, Tori Productions founder and namesake, just not able to secure enough funding for a better, or at least more consistently animated show? That's hard to say. There aren't many hard numbers from that time that are available to a more casual researcher, and that goes triple with smaller and less successful studios, such as the one in question. But there was one bigger problem that we can be more certain of. Daikengo was Tori Productions' first, and indeed only, animated production, produced with Takotoku Toys as their main sponsor. Takotoku had previously worked with Tatsunoko producing die-cast toys for many of the Time Boken series. They are mostly remembered today for producing the original transformable Valkyrie fighters for the later robot show Macross, which would also serve as the initial model for the Toy 4 Transformer Jetfire. A Super Robot cartoon both sponsored by and promoting a die-cast toy of its robot might sound like a tried-and-true formula. However, well, a fact I've mentioned before in earlier videos, and which is key for understanding this historical moment for anime, is that in 1976 there were 7 robot shows produced by 6 studios. In 1977 there were 6 robot shows produced by 4 studios, but in 1978 there were only 3 shows, and in 1979 there would be only 2. There were just too many toy robots for the number of kids and their parents' pocketbooks to support, and so the market contracted. Some more historically minded viewers might also note that this lines up pretty closely with the 1979 oil crisis as well. Of those 5 shows in those 2 years, 4 would be produced by one studio, Sunrise. By dint of craft or business acumen or just sheer luck, they had managed to dominate, becoming the remaining studio serving that genre, at least until the market rebounded in the 80s. The other show was, clearly, Space Demon Daikengo. Tori Production had entered a narrowing field otherwise entirely captured by a single studio. This, as much as anything else, was probably what doomed Daikengo. It was too late to compete against the host of more derivative robot shows they had a few years before it, and it was too early for the more outer spacey shows that more closely resembled that would run in the early 80s. It just stood on its own next to Sunrise's Daitoran 3 and Daimos, 2 shows which, not for nothing, are frequently considered some of the best of the decade. And if that wasn't enough to damn it to obscurity, the following year would see Sunrise's Mobile Suit Gundam. You have not heard of Space Demon Daikengo. You have heard of Gundam. So, it was left as a poorly funded show with questionable production values set up against the rising giant. That being said, being a fan of anime from this period will have you develop a tolerance for questionable production values. And again, it's not like Daikengo doesn't have anything going for it aesthetically. It has a lot of cool space imagery, cool machines, neat graphic effects, and just its general look can be quite striking at moments. Economics may have meant it was unsuccessful in its time, but what led to it being largely unremembered in the time since is how those flourishes and embellishments adorn a whole lot of vacant storytelling. Episode 12, Summoning the Storm on the King's Planet, has Prince Ryger, Ryger's younger brother and current heir to planet Imperius, and the original assigned pilot to the Daikengo, uncovers solid evidence that Defense Minister Doles is colluding with the Magellans in return for being made its suzerain. However, when Ryger reports his finding to his father the king doesn't believe him. This could be the start of some exciting, intense family and political drama. But any chance of that is quickly squashed by Doles simply walking in and announcing that, yes, he is in fact a traitor, and moreover, he intends to be doing his traitoring at this very moment. Ryger nearly escapes on a space fighter jet only to be shot down. When the Daikengo serendipitously drifts by and spots the disabled fighter, Ryger and Clea offer prayer to its presumed dead pilot and then continue on. Soon after, Doles contacts them. He demands they return to planet Imperius or else risk the lives of its king and queen. They do so, are apprehended by Doles, and are presented to Rebolian for execution. Rebolian, needlessly but predictably, renegades on his deal with Doles and tries to kill the whole lot of them. Is this the end? Have the Magellans won? Obviously not, as we're then shown a flashback that's all of 7 seconds long, in which Bryman rescues Ryger and then the two of them rescue everyone else. Following this are a bunch of fight scenes against Rebolian and his crew, ending with Doles sacrificing his life to take a bullet for Ryger. This episode abruptly ends, with King Impel of Imperius recognizing his son Ryger's good work, Cleo being exonerated by her father's dying sacrifice, all the good guys rallying to fight Magellans, and the show's central premise and most interesting complication being firmly resolved. And there are still 14 episodes left. This is a major turning point for the show, and it's an episode where all the most critical action happens in a 7-second flashback. It's like both everything and nothing happens, which is bad. The show makes some overture at having a new long-term story beat with our heroes soon encountering a space storm which surrounds and protects the planet Magellan. Only its own forces know the secret of navigating it safely, and attempts by our heroes to pass through it fail. But the storm doesn't and can't function as a source of narrative tension in the same manner. It might as well not exist when our heroes aren't engaging with it. It's not constant or oppressive the way Cleo and Ryger contemplating their cursed fates as renegades against their fathers were. This show resolves its central premise and replaces it with nothing. And on the topic of not engaging with the premise, let's talk about the Earth episodes. Episode 7 has Emperor Magellan himself command Lady Barracross to send Rebellion and their forces to obtain the help of the people of planet Earth, a planet where men stronger than any others thrive. Our heroes overhear this, and after talking up Earth for a moment, decide to go warn its people that Rebellion intends to conquer them. That doesn't really happen. Ryger lands in secret, encounters one 8-year-old boy, and then takes the kid to Mars where he gets to watch Ryger and Rebellion sword fight. Then Ryger returns the boy to Earth. Effectively, nothing happens. Huh? Fast forward 10 episodes, that's 10, as in one more than 9, 10 episodes later, and we get our second episode that features planet Earth. We are again told that Emperor Magellan wants Earthlings. They seem to like wars, Lady Barracross notes. To rule the galaxy, we need strong soldiers. After maybe 4 minutes of Sabu, the Earth boy from the earlier episode, just living his life, Magellans finally land on the planet. We cut to Rebellion talking to the UN, falsely declaring that he comes in peace. What follows is a contrived series of events where Sabu attempts to contact Ryger for help, leading him to break into the Magellan's base to use the space communicator, leading him to be captured by Rebellion, who explains his wicked plot to the kid within earshot of his cassette recorder, before the kid manages to escape and deliver the evidence to the UN, who immediately turn on Rebellion. This all happens within 5 minutes. The whole bit where the UN becomes convinced by the cassette tape happens off-screen. And at any rate, the United Earth forces aren't any match for the Magellan space weapons. Earth only escapes subjugation because Ryger and the Daikengo show up to save the day. It took me a week to get through this one episode. It's easily the worst of the show. Which is tragic because on the surface it sounds really fun, but with Sabu having convinced the grown-ups around him the alien benefactors are actually malicious. It's a little bit Twilight Zone and very 60s science fiction in a way that I usually enjoy. For example, Zambot 3 presented a very similar scenario, and I loved it in that cartoon. But here, well, it either needs to move through its story faster, or it needs to fill it out with more of something, anything. All the plot beats are present and in a correct order, but there isn't anything else going on. It's like they animated a story outline. There's one final Earth episode, episode 22, which is almost entirely composed of recycled footage. 7 minutes into the episode and Rebellion has already conquered Earth. Lady Barracross disguises herself as an Earth scientist to trick and kidnap Sabu to use him as bait for Ryger and Cleo. They show up, get trapped, using re-footage from an earlier episode where they got trapped under different circumstances, are freed by Sabu, who was able to escape earlier with the help of his pet dog, and then the day is saved. It ends with Earth joining the Galactic Alliance, and that's the last we see of the planet Earth. Good riddance. Why does the show feature modern-day Earth at all? It doesn't fit in with anything else the show has going on. I have to imagine they were a request from some sponsor that decided a storyline on Earth would be more appealing to its audience than high fantasy space adventures. It'd be disheartening to think this was a more genuine creative decision. Most tragic of all, what little I could find out about Daikengo's reception in Japan was heavily focused on these 3 episodes. When the show is remembered at all, it's because of them. Why is the so-called rowdy wanderer of the stars, a formerly exiled prince who illegally and treasonously fought against the Magellans to defend his planet, acting the part of a white-bread savior of the Earth's status quo? And why is Rebellion, the robot Napoleon, acting in the role of the insidious infiltrator, a role that's commonly interpreted to represent a conspiratorial take on communism? Am I to understand Napoleon as a member of the Revolutionary Vanguard? And what's up with how each episode tells us that Ryger was thinking about the little boy from Earth? If I were Cleo, I'd be getting concerned. Another curious inclusion, not quite discordant but curious, is the show's focus on religion and faith. In episode 10, the Magellans invade Alsabala, a planet which contains a holy site to the people of the galaxy. When one of its captured inhabitants, a young woman named Jean, of course, prays to her god for deliverance, he replies that she will be saved by the cosmic devil, Daikengo. But first, she must go to Daikengo and inform it of her people's trouble in person. I kinda love this for several reasons. For one, it makes the Space Demon Daikengo, which was brought to life by the Devil Star, not just a cool boast, but a relevant and established fact to the setting. God vouches for it. The robot is officially a demon. For another, bravo to the show for just having God be a character with the speaking role. That is the kind of chutzpah I like in old anime. Anyways, Jean is able to escape and quickly encounters Ryger and Cleo. Listen to her plea and do succeed in saving the planet. There's additional drama with Ryger's mother, the Queen, coming in secret to El Sabella to pray for an end to the galactic conflict. Ryger has the opportunity to speak with her for the first time since fleeing his own planet, but refuses out of respect for Jean, who lost her own mother in the battle to end the planet's occupation. El Sabella is mentioned again much later in episode 24, The Challenge of Star Satan, in which Ryger and Cleo bring a young girl to an orphanage there after the titular Star Satan kills her family. It's one of the few times the Planet of the Week makes a second appearance. Faith is mostly a minor element of the show, but once it was brought into focus, I started noticing it elsewhere. Crosses and crucifixes show up with some regularity, especially as grave markers. Ryger and Cleo both pray for the dead on multiple occasions. In one episode, when Ryger is concerned that Bryman might have killed an innocent man, he remarks that while he wants to trust Bryman, only God knows the truth. Cleo gets a fun moment in episode 18, The Mysterious Ghost Planet, when she's struck ill, seemingly in response to her prayers for Ryger's safety. Ryger ventures to the planet without her and gets trapped, and she's able to escape that danger and bail him out only because of her illness delayed her. God works in mysterious ways. The episode also has Cleo storm out on Ryger after the two get into a fight, only for the robots to say out loud, "She doesn't actually hate you, she's just acting this way because she feels vulnerable." Anime had that tsundere routine around all the way back then, huh?
ライガーのバカ。
I don't have anything against this not quite Christianity in the show, but it fits weirdly with the character of Ryger as this rebellious prince whose intemperance led him to be condemned by his own planet. Is he a riotous troublemaker whose eager violence ironically makes him the most appropriate person to pilot Daikengo? Or is he some straight-laced good Christian boy who defends our moral values? I'm not going to square that circle in this video. I think it's possible. I think the show leaves enough space to construct a complete model of his character such that his dualist expressions of fidelity and rebellion are aligned, but doing so would require a lot of extrapolation from very little evidence. To be uncharitable, if the show doesn't care about this, why should I? Dr. Gunther, the Magellan scientist who rebuilt Bryman in secret and a captive forced to aid the war effort against his will, learns of a hidden space lighthouse. This outpost broadcasts a path through the space storm that surrounds the planet Magellan, and seizing it could either permit the invasion of the Magellan homeworld or else deny access to or from it altogether. Dr. Gunther brings this information to Bryman, who brings it to Ryger and Cleo. Plans are then made to destroy it and thereby decapitate the Magellan forces. Ryger rethinks this plan after speaking with the lighthouse's officer, Commander Mori, who pleads on behalf of the planet's many inhabitants who are unconnected with Emperor Magellan or his war effort. Ryger suggests that if they were led to the planet, they could fight against Emperor Magellan directly, and not only spare the population the hardship of isolation, but free them from a despot. Commander Mori accepts this on the condition of a captive to guarantee Ryger's goodwill. Cleo, still self-effacing even now, offers herself as the hostage. Where things get interesting is when Lady Barracross and Rebolian catch on to this plan. Their response is not to intercept our heroes, but to destroy the space lighthouse themselves. This would trap Daikengo and Bryman on Magellan, leaving them free to cause havoc as they wish. And maybe their boss, the ambiguously magical Emperor Magellan, will escape the space storm with his own powers, or maybe he can't. If worse comes to worse, Lady Barracross and Rebolian can simply use their remaining forces to live as modest space pirates. This audacious scheme is foiled when Prince Ryger, Ryger's younger brother, arrives to defend the lighthouse. Following the attempted coup against his royal family episode 12, Prince Ryger has worked to marshal all available forces within the Galactic Alliance into a unified fleet. In a show of power, he then unleashes a new weapon that dispels the space storm altogether, allowing a full-scale attack on the planet Magellan. From this point on, things proceed as you might expect. Cleo reunites with Ryger, and the two of them, plus Bryman, plus the robots, jointly attack the Magellan's main base. Ryger has a fencing match with Rebolian, and when Rebolian tries to pull the trick that got Ryger's older brother Zamson killed back in episode 1, Bryman is able to recognize and intercept it. The base self-destructs in an attempt to catch the Daikengo and its crew, but of course the only one who dies is Rebolian, saving the cat the indignity of having to kill him. Emperor Magellan appears as a weird floating space monster, and Daikengo and Bryman defeat him. Lady Barracross escapes, vowing a vengeance which will never come to pass. The final celebration happens on planet Imperius in a vast, empty field. The background images, which have been one of the highlights of the show up until now, look only halfway finished in these shots. Even though all misunderstandings have finally been cleared, our heroes remain restless. Bryman chooses to give up his claim to the planet Imperius, rather than living on as Zamson, and rides his dumb robot rocking horse off into the heavens. Ryger and Cleo board the Daikengo once again to become roving heroes, refusing life as idle royalty. The young Prince Ryger remains as the sole heir to King Impel. The show just kind of ends. The confrontation with Rebolian doesn't feel climactic, it's just that time he didn't manage to get away. The fearsome Emperor Magellan is just another big monster for the Daikengo to trounce. I guess we learn who Bryman is or was, but we already knew that. Everything feels very abrupt and very anticlimactic. This is a two-parter, but it feels like any other Situation of the Week episode. Once again, I'm left with the impression that too much and not enough happens. Once again, it feels like Tori Productions simply animated an outline. Tori Productions actually began production work on a follow-up series, Dragon Tiger Giant Go Kaiser. That show would never see a completion, although the comic that was intended to accompany the show would have several chapters published, and the toy, also by toy company Takutoku, would come out. The comic supposedly promoted itself by decreeing that the era of combining robots is over. The transforming robot has finally been born. This would prove to be a prescient statement, but as before, Tori Productions would not be able to capitalize on this insight. With no cartoon produced, whatever input they had on its development is hard to guess. However much an obscurity the Daikengo cartoon may be, it at least does exist. Tori Productions would do oddball work for other studios for a few more years, but would never spearhead production of another cartoon. Its founder, Genzu Toriyumi, would afterwards join Sunrise, where he would work under Yosuke Takahashi on the production of Votoms and Gallant. Later, he'd return to Tatsunoko and work on Southern Cross. My understanding is that he was a well-regarded figure. Tori Productions simply happened to be a venture that didn't pan out. Daikengo's most notable achievement, at least to my eye, remains how it managed to preempt many of the upcoming trends in the genre. The other side of that coin is that if there was anything about my description of the cartoon that seemed intriguing to you, there's probably a much better example that came out a few years later. 1981's Saikyo Robo Dioja is perhaps the most obvious successor. It's a show about the young prince of the galaxy traveling to various planets under his rule in disguise to right wrongs and correct injustice, using the power of his royal combining robot, the Dioja, to provide muscle when needed. My understanding is that it takes place in effectively Edo-era Japan, but in space. I can't speak on it personally, having never watched it, but as an early 80s Sunrise show, I'm confident it's a very good-looking kids cartoon at the very least. Another somewhat similar show is Galactic Cyclone Ryger, also from 1981. Whereas Daikengo was something of a Taiga drama in space, Ryger was a Hisatsu show in space, with that being a series revolving around ninjas, read professional assassins, but with something of a Robin Hood bent. It was produced by Kokusai Eigasha, another animation studio which, like Toei Productions, came to a rather unfortunate end. But getting into all of that would be a whole other video. I have seen Ryger, and it's a show I like a lot. It's frankly not all that good, but is a very enjoyable type of bad. Mock historical epics were never really common, but there were a handful in the early 80s, before the success of Zeta Gundam and the Transformers sucked all the oxygen from the room. Not that no one makes shows like that anymore, just the new ones tend not to have giant robots in them. On a more aesthetic level, Daikengo's outer spaciness would also become far more common. Gundam, Idion, God Mars, there's just a ton of shows that would just be set in space. It proliferated so much it hardly feels worth bringing up. A naive view of bad 70s cartoon might be that they are unhinged, with too wild ideas and disconnected plot lines that may offer a lot of spectacle in the moment, but fail to cohere as a full show. There are shows like that, several of them, Many of the earlier Dynamic Pro robot shows, such as Mazinger Z and Get a Robo, are a little bit like that. Use Your ID and Combattler V, two shows by Sunrise that I've covered on this channel, also fit that mold to a greater or lesser extent. But the real bad 70s cartoons are different. The real bad robot cartoons aren't shows with too much energy where too much happens. They're shows where hardly anything happens at all, and what zaniness there is can't disguise that. Space Demon Daikengo, as much as I have come to love it, is this latter type of show. It's all bones. There's no meat on it. That means it's not an obvious candidate for a video series titled Super Robot Blueprint. It's not particularly important to the genre's development. It was a flop and its studio died. But Daikengo can make an instructive point of comparison, with Tori Productions as a sort of goofus to Sunrise's Gallant. Making an enjoyable, successful cartoon is hard. It is very, very hard, even before you factor in the necessity of promoting and selling a toy. It can be informative to watch a cartoon that doesn't quite pull it off, even if it can do some things remarkably well. And really, there isn't anything that Daikengo does that's truly bad, it just doesn't lean in far enough on what it does good. The dynamic with Ryger and Cleo both being on the run, both hating their fathers for separate but connective reasons, is really compelling. I love how Ryger shows a keen anger in comparison to Cleo's more caustic despair, and how that led to his measured approach to violence versus her more suicidal recklessness. The show just didn't do enough with that conceit, and at any rate it was all wrapped up with a bow 12 episodes in. Fryman, as much as I hate his dumb flying robot horse, has some cool stuff going on. The bit where the show hints that he's basically been reprogrammed to assassinate Emperor Magellan, and how that alteration to his person means he can no longer identify with his pre-cyborg life, even though he agrees that assassinating the Emperor is a good and appropriate thing for him to be doing, that's all cool. It's brought up in one episode and immediately resolved. It's mentioned a few times later to no real point or effect. A lot of Daikengo's problems may perversely come from what might seem to be a point of strength. The show avoids many of the more prominent Super Robot show cliches. It's just that, without the framework those cliches provide, the show isn't able to structure itself. I've mentioned before in previous videos that a big problem I have with many Super Robot shows is how they can struggle to sustain a full run of episodes. The shows I really like either have something else going on, like Voltus 5 turning political in its back half, have a shorter episode count and faster pacing, like Zambot 3, or else are such outrageous exhibitions of the craft of animation that alone can carry the show, like Daitarn 3. With Daikengo, it's not that it has too many episodes, it comes in a svelte 26, but that the episodes themselves are too long. The show frequently reminded me of those old super short Hanna-Barbera cartoons, something like the original Alex Toth Space Ghost or Birdman or the like, an impression helped by the UPA style aesthetics. But those Hanna-Barbera cartoons had episodes that were 8 or 10 minutes long. They just air several back-to-back to fill a time slot. Daikengo feels like a show that should have been built around that model, but instead you have 10 minutes of story stretched to a full half an hour. If you chopped an episode of Daikengo to the bone, so that it was just Ryger and Cleo finding themselves in trouble, having a brief adventure, and then immediately kicking whatever villain's ass, all wrapped up before the commercial break, then that show would be a hoot. I first learned about Daikengo from 34 Years of Super Robots. While that set of videos was quite popular when they first came out, increasing accessibility to anime knowledge has since obviated it, and it's become quite hard to find. I took the liberty of uploading my own copy to the Internet Archive, so if you're curious about that tiny bit of mecha fandom history, and if the Internet Archive has been burned down like the Library of Alexandria yet, you can feel free to check those out. It should be linked in the description. For a long time, Daikengo has been my white whale, a robot show so obscure you could barely find evidence it aired. I am immensely grateful to have watched it, even if I had to parcel out those early episodes 3 minutes at a time over the course of weeks for my own sanity. That this terrible show is fan-subbed at all is like a tiny gift to me from the universe. To the folks at Lura and TMU Subs, and everyone else who worked to fan-sub this series, I sincerely thank you. Daikengo has had something of a minor resurgence in, not really popularity, but awareness. The show was rebroadcasted as reruns on a Toei-owned channel back in 2008, and it astonishingly enough had a Blu-ray release in March of 2025. That release has pretty incredible fidelity, and while it doesn't really rescue the show, it really reveals the craft and artistry that went into it. There are so many gorgeous individual images. Can I recommend Space Demon Daikengo? Well, if you're already enough a Super Robot sicko, then you won't need my endorsement. And if you need my endorsement, well, you're not enough of a Super Robot sicko. But if you would like a very entertaining superhero outro from the 70s, one with emotionally resonant stakes and constant forward momentum, delivers on its action in just over 20 episodes, go watch Zambot 3.
迫るマゼラン横目で睨みビュンとうなるぜベルト犬そうさ俺は宇宙の男ライガー
ライガーがバカ。